person, you can participate in this interactive quiz that we'll have going, and panelists are going to talk about the answers to the quiz. But I encourage you to join this quiz because there are prizes for the top 3 winners. So you can join by going to joinmyquiz.com and enter the code, which is 724915. And I will give you a hint that to win, you need to answer both correctly and quickly. That's how the winners are calculated. So be careful. There's some questions in there that might be a little tricky. So welcome everybody. This is our panel for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, titled Understanding Family Violence. I welcome all of you here today. I know many of you are students in our classes. If you're not here in person, welcome virtually, live streaming, yay, hello. I'm Dr. Bree Beaupre. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Victim Studies here in the College of Criminal Justice. It's an honor to be here representing our department, which is the first and only victim studies department that exists. So it's really cool that we have this here at SHSU. We have a major, we have a minor program, and we also have a master's program. So if you're interested in anything related to victimization or victimology, come hang out with us in victim studies. First, I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists here today. Our first is Dr. Shelley Clevenger. Dr. Shelley Clevenger is an associate professor and the chair in the Department of Victim Studies. And so we're really lucky to have Dr. Clevenger here. She is an expert in sexual assault research, intimate partner violence, and particularly cyber victimization. So we're very excited to have her here. I'm actually going to ask you two to introduce yourselves because I would love to hear more about your agencies that you work for. And I know that you'll do the best job representing that.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Hey guys, my name's Megan Elsner. I work for a agency in Conroe called Children's Safe Harbor. We are the local CAC, that's the Children's Advocacy Center down in Conroe. We partner with quite a few other agencies, law enforcement, the DA's office. We obviously partner with several other agencies in our area. We were just talking about how we ping pong off our resources up here. But yeah, I've been with them for about a year. We serve clients that are victims of crime and their families. And yeah, we see it all. We see domestic violence, we see sexual abuse, we see witnesses to accidents and homicides and things like that. Children's Safe Harbor has been around for I think 24, 25 years. Don't quote me on that. I know it's in the 20s. And it's serving the community and it's only getting bigger. We are growing because Montgomery County is growing. And so that tends to ripple out with all of that stuff, unfortunately. So we have a team of like 10 clinicians right now that are serving the agency, but that's not the only people that work there. We don't just have counselors. We have family advocates. We have, crisis forensic interviewers and things like that we use to assist families in all kinds of different ways. So thanks for having us here.
And some of our graduates from our victim studies programs have gone on to work at Children's Safe Harbor.
Hi everybody, my name is Linda Quiroz and I am actually a graduate of Sam Houston State University 2016. So I work with Montgomery County Women's Center. I have been with the Women's Center for almost 6 years. I am a sexual assault and domestic violence advocate and I'm also an outreach education coordinator. So we're a nonprofit agency and what we're known for is working with victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse. We work with men, women, and children and in the LGBTQ spectrum. All the services that we provide are completely free. So if anybody has been a victim, is going through it, they're out of it. Some people think that you have to be going through it, but not necessarily. You could have gone through it 20 years ago and you're still a victim, and we will still service you no matter what. We also work with children, but we start at a specific age just because our counseling is not so much focused on children like Children's Safe Harbor is. But Children's Safe Harbor is actually maybe 2 minutes away from us. So we partner a lot, and we communicate all the time on services and how to provide better services for our clients. So thank y'all for having us.
I'm actually going to pass around these sticky notes with this basket. If you would like to share a note of support for a survivor, be mindful that the survivors are both children and adults. So if you'd like to send a message of support, you can write a note and put it in this basket. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started with this quiz in just a moment. So if you haven't yet, please join. If you're here in person, join myquiz.com and then enter in the code 724915. And I'm going to go ahead and get it started in just a minute.
I think the price is like, I hope it says stop gift card.
Hello? Okay, we're good. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and push start, and it's going to start the first question. This is kind of a warm-up question. All right, so family violence includes only physical injury. Is that true or false? You have 30 seconds to answer these questions. You got 15 seconds left. True or false? All right. So what was the answer? False. Good. Yes. So we got our leaderboard here. The answer's false. Most of you got that right. So I'm going to ask the panelists to talk a little bit about what family violence entails and what else it includes beyond physical injury.
Is it working? Yeah, okay. I guess I'll start first since I have the mic. So I think this one, when people hear either the terms family violence or domestic violence, I think the first thing people think of is physical. There has to be some kind of physical abuse, and that's not so much so. Family violence can entail emotional abuse, psychological, mental, verbal, spiritual abuse we have seen, sexual abuse. There's all forms of abuse with it, but I think that when it comes to the term family violence, we automatically want to think physical. There has to be some kind of physical injury. Many times when I work with clients, I will see that there are a variety of different types of abuse, so they will be physically and maybe emotionally abused, physically and sexually. They correlate one or another. There's never really just one. Does anybody want to add more to that?
I also want to add that cyber can go along with this as well, and financial abuse. I have some really interesting research that saw that identity theft was committed by family members. So we often think of identity theft as some stranger getting your debit card when you're paying at Target. Instead of, it could be someone you're married to, in a relationship with, or a parent.
Yeah, parents that use their kids' social security or something like that, especially when you have like families who have mixed status of like legality, like being in the States or, you know, being a resident of Mexico, or even just immigrants. That does happen, that identity theft.
I think another thing with that too is working with the victims themselves. I remember I would get victims sometimes who would call and would say, I don't know if I'm a victim because I'm not being hit. And so then I would ask them, tell me a little bit about what's going on, what happened to you, and they would say, well, this person belittles me, this person makes me feel like I'm worthless, this person controls all the accounts, I have no access, right? But never once mentioned the physical abuse, and so they don't think they are being abused because there is no physical. And so I think that starts with how somebody grows up with society, how we look at family violence in general. So even then, we will have victims who still don't think they are being abused because there is no physical. And we will see sometimes there will be victims who will compare the situation and will say, well, because I'm not being physically abused, I'm okay. It's fine. It hasn't gotten that bad. Yes.
One of the things too, so before I became a professor, I had worked in the field, but it wasn't for me, so I really give you both big applause because it was really hard. But one of the things I saw a lot in relation to thinking about family violence was neglect, where kids were not being taken care of, and that is a form of family violence or abuse. And so that's something that, you know, when you think of violence, you think of the physical, you think of the hitting, but that is also a physical sort of act, just kind of in a different way.
Yeah, you can.
And I think with physical too, people think, you know, it has to be on your body, but physical can be around you. You know, if somebody was to take your phone from you and break it in your face, right? If somebody was to punch the wall next to you, a lot of times what we hear victims say is, well, they didn't hit me, right? They hit the wall next to me. They slammed the door. They broke the phone. They broke this. They broke property. That's still physical, you know, because the goal of me physically acting out this way is to intimidate you, right? To have that power and control over you. So ultimately, when we hear physical, it doesn't have to be on your body. It can be as simple as punching the wall next to you, taking your phone, breaking it. I mean, it doesn't have to leave a bruise or a mark on you, okay?
These are great responses. I think what I'm getting from this is that physical injury is not the only thing that can constitute family violence, and it can also include emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and also non-action or neglect. So family violence can be a lot more than physical injury. So great job. Thank you, panelists. We're going to move forward to the next question. How many domestic violence incidents occurred in 2019? Is it 875,000, 1.2 million, 1.8 million, or 2 million? What do you think? You got 3 seconds. Okay. So the answer is 1.2 million domestic violence incidents that are reported. So I'm going to ask the panelists about how many clients do you see or serve on a given week or month?
A given week. So back in the day, I used to see a full caseload of like 40 kids a week. But now I think I average closer to 20, which is way better work-life balance, y'all. But yeah, I mean, as far as families we serve, we have 10 clinicians, and a full caseload is like 25, so 250 a week.
Wow.
Possible.
That's higher than I would
spots.
have imagined.
We don't have, like, sometimes we don't necessarily have like an entire full caseload every time. So that number can fluctuate, but we can serve up to that many a week. Yeah.
Does it fluctuate depending on time of year? Or?
Yes. In school, out of school, at least at my agency, you know, holidays are slower and things like that. COVID really hit us hard. You know, we couldn't be seeing people in person for a while. We had to do virtual, which was a really big adjustment, but actually I think a really good adjustment because we got to serve a lot more people that maybe would have not necessarily been able to receive services. And we still do that. We still have the telemental health options. But yes, it does fluctuate seasonally and things like that. So.
Great.
Now, because I'm not on the counseling side, the only number I can really remember the most was from 2019 to 2020 for us. So like our hotline calls operate 24/7, and I remember 2019, I think our calls were maybe at like 25,000 for the year. 2020, we were at 53,000 hotline calls. And that just kind of told us of how much that increased. And right now, it seems like we're hitting the 30s, about to be in the 40s of hotline calls, and a majority of those calls are family violence. And then we have a team of advocates who respond to the hospital for family violence and sexual assault calls. In 2020, they responded to, no, 2021, I'm lying. 2021, they responded to 515. Half of those were, I want to say, family violence cases. Right now, we are not even at the end of the year, and I think they've already surpassed 515 if we're talking about half of them being family violence. So each year, the numbers are getting higher. They're not going lower, which is sad, but part of it is also knowing what to do. What do we do as a society? What do we do in our role of how do we get the help and how do we help these victims?
We see the same thing. Our numbers are going up, but that's because people are reporting it. Like, people are being educated and we're reaching out and they know they have options, which is great. So it's not necessarily that it's becoming more of a problem, it's just that people are talking about it and actually seeking assistance, which I think is beautiful. So, yeah. And then I also want to say you put me to shame with the statistics. That was great. That's a clinical director question for my agency, not a me one.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you. Those numbers were actually shocking for me. I did not realize it was that high. So it just highlights the important work that you all are doing. So next question. What type of family violence is the most common? One of you were here real early. You might know the answer. What type of family violence is the most common? Intimate partner violence, sibling abuse, elder abuse, or child abuse? If you took family violence with me, you probably know the answer. All right. So the correct answer is sibling abuse. Nobody got it. I know. This one is real surprising. It gets students every time. So I was wondering if our panelists could talk a little bit about if they've seen this in their work. Maybe is it perhaps underreported? What have you seen working in the field?
We kind of sort of talked about this a second ago, but the idea of sibling abuse being the most common, I think we don't necessarily identify that as abuse. Like, when people are talking about these things, we have to remember that not everyone has an operational definition of these terms, right? So we have to kind of take that into account. But yes, we do work within my agency. We do work with siblings. We have behavioral stuff that we can do, behavioral interventions and things like that. If it's just a lack of education or impulse control on the kid's part. If it's like sexual abuse between siblings, maybe they're really young. We label those things as like problematic sexual behaviors, and we do have specific interventions and treatment that we use for those instances of abuse. If it's an older kiddo and a younger kiddo, there are treatment options for them too. At our agency, we do not treat older alleged perpetrators, but that's something that we're working to offer to the community. But we just don't have that right now, so we usually source that out, but we do work with the alleged victims.
Have you seen that in your work, Linda?
So when this question, when I saw it, I was still like on the fence on which one it was too.
Yeah.
But the only thing that I can remember, and going off of what you're saying, is really a lot of it is not really called like sibling abuse, and I think it's the way that it's seen. I remember when I would go on calls, and I think the sibling abuse would happen, but it was just not reported because they wanted to figure it out within family. Like, it was more like, it's a family thing, we need to keep it within each other. So what I would see sometimes, especially when we would go into Children's Safe Harbor and do calls with families, is if a child was a victim of sexual abuse within the family, and let's say that the child didn't make an outcry till a year, 2 years later, and the child didn't get the help and maybe was not believed by the family, what then we would see is that then child would then reoffend within the siblings, and so then it would continue. And so that's how I would see the abuse within, either physical or sexual. But now that we talk about it more, I can see why that one is definitely the most common one for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, this surprised me too when I started teaching family violence. I was like, really? Whoa. Yeah. It's also, I think, normalized as sibling rivalry. So I think that's part of why it's underreported and it's just normalized. So that might be part of this as well. So good job, everybody. We're going to go to the next question. And I know we talk a lot about IPV, so I understand why most people answered IPV, because that gets the most attention. Women and men are equally likely to experience family violence and abuse. True or false? Women and men are equally likely to experience family violence and abuse. Let's see. All right, so a 50-50 split pretty much. The answer is false. So I'm going to defer to Dr. Clevenger first, and then Linda and Megan to see if they've noticed gendered patterns in family violence and abuse.
Yes. So women or females often experience it at higher levels, as we know by who reports it. So when we look at, if you look at official statistics, you will see more females who have reported more so than men, or if you look at those statistics where they say 1 in 4 or 1 in 6. But I also want to say that doesn't mean that males are not experiencing this. It just might mean that they're not reporting at the same rate. There's a lot of stigma attached to male victimization, especially if it was them being victimized by a female or another male. There's all sorts of different gender dynamics related to that. So this is a tricky question.
Yeah.
But women, if we want a straight answer, women have a higher reported rate, yes.
Especially sexual.
Agreed, 110%.
Right?
Yeah, agreed.
Dr. Shelley took everything, and she was right about everything. I think I can go back to when I used to do the on-calls and I would respond to the hospital. When they would call us to come out and respond to a sexual assault or domestic violence call, and I would get males who were in the hospital, I mean, the response was, "What are you doing here? I don't want you here." And so that was not my cue to leave. I would say, okay, I am here if you need anything. And I would treat them exactly the same way that I would treat any other survivor. But I would say in a month, if I got, let's say, 5 women that I saw and then I saw 5 men, all 5 women probably did report. Out of the 5 men, maybe 1 did, and then decided that maybe I shouldn't. So definitely it has to do a lot with the stigma and the underreporting. But I would see many male victims in the hospital as well for both sexual assault and domestic violence.
I want to be clear, we also serve males. We do see male victims of abuse and crime. And specifically, we have more adult family members that are being referred in. We try really hard if we see individuals in the family that are maybe struggling or having a hard time processing to also get those family members referred in for services. We do service the whole family unit, and so that's something that we can do. And sometimes they take a little bit more cajoling or, getting in, like buying into the treatment modality. But I think 9 times out of 10, when we frame it as like, this is going to help the whole family, they're really receptive to coming in. Yeah, they want to come in and engage a lot more than it's just like, oh, come in for individual session. Like, let's talk to you. They like the family stuff. So we have a better time with that. But yeah, we do that as well.
One of the issues has been for a long time, women or females were the only ones being served or treated at different centers. And so that is no longer the case. Most places, as you heard here, do take male victims, but for a long time, the focus was on women or females. So people might have the wrong notion that they're not able to be served or they're not wanted or there isn't a place for them, but there is a place for male victims today.
And if you take a class with me or Dr. Clevenger, you'll learn about how the patriarchy shapes this and our perceptions of victims and who can be a victim. And so it can negatively impact men in particular and deter them from reporting. So good job, everybody. Next question. Intimate partner violence is usually a one-time isolated event. True or false? Got 18 seconds. Five, four, three, two, one. Right. Let's see. All right. So the majority of you got this correct. The answer is false. Intimate partner violence is usually not a one-time isolated event. And so I'm going to defer to our panelists about how they see perhaps repeat clients or this manifesting over time.
Yeah, I think this is one of those questions that we want to be the other way around. Yeah. We want the answer to be true, but it's not. I see this manifesting in my agency as parents or caregivers who have their own history of complex violence, complex PTSD, and maybe are having a repeat marriage that's having the same patterns, and these things are now impacting their kiddos and stuff like that, or even sometimes kiddos who are repeating patterns of what they have seen in their households and becoming violent themselves, and then they're getting older, and so the mom can no longer, physically restrain them, or they're starting to actually scare, their parents or their other siblings, things like that. That's how I see it manifesting in my agency.
When I think about this question, it goes back to the question that we talked about, physical injury, in a sense, because when we talk about intimate partner violence, there's all kinds of forms of abuse. And so when we think of a one-time isolated event, and because I've heard things like this where I've had clients who will say, well, they only hit me once, and that was it. But then we talk about, okay, well, where's the other kinds of abuse coming from, which could be the controlling, the gaslighting, which we all know what that is.
Can you explain for people who might not know?
So gaslight, has anybody ever heard the term before? Yeah, a couple of you guys. So in short terms, I like to compare it to, it's the feeling of somebody wants to make you feel like you're going crazy, right? So maybe I did hit you, but what the abuser will say is, well, are you sure? And are you sure that happened, right? Or I didn't say it this way, right? So in a sense, it's kind of making you feel like minimizing it, deflecting. Sometimes we will see abusers say, well, I'm sorry, but sometimes the I'm sorries come with, but you shouldn't have done this, right? So in a sense, it comes back to blaming the victim for why the abuse is happening. But it definitely is not a one-time isolated event. It comes in all forms. And so sometimes we bring it back to one isolated because it only happened once. This type of abuse only happened once, but really it's all forms, so it can happen in many different types.
in doing interviews with survivors of intimate partner violence, there are all those different kinds. But one of the things that a lot of people have told me was they thought it was going to be a one time. So the person did something violent, and then I've heard this term before, love bombed the person, meaning they had some sort of romantic grand gesture. They bought them lots of presents. They bought them flowers. They told them how much they loved them. And so they wanted to believe that this was the one time, because they're like, no, they love me, right? They made a mistake. Everybody's human. I'm a forgiving person. But then it wasn't. And so the duration can vary. It could be, days, weeks, months, or even years. But it's usually not just that isolated event, as unfortunately a lot of survivors have told me.
Great. Thank you all for your input, and good job, audience. Most of you got that one. All right, next question. This is 6 of 10. IPV only occurs in straight relationships, and so that's a cis man, cis woman. IPV only occurs in straight relationships. True or false? Three, two, one. All right, let's see. All right. So that is false. All of you got it right. Good job.
Yay!
Yay. So I'm going to ask the panelists to talk a little bit about what they've seen among LGBTQ plus individuals.
From what I've seen, the relationship dynamics are pretty much the same. Anytime you have intimate relationships or people who have kids involved and things like that, the sexual orientation doesn't necessarily matter. It has an impact in different ways. But as far as manifesting, interpersonal violence, there's no difference. If you have the personality or, predilection to do that, you're going to find an opportunity regardless of your orientation.
I also want to say one of the things when we think about relationships that aren't what we would consider straight relationships, there's an added aspect of someone trying to out them. So I've done research with folks who are in LGBTQ relationships, and their partner said, you better listen and do what I say and not tell anybody that I hit you, rape you, whatever it is, or I'm going to out you at work, or I'm going to tell your family. And so there's this whole other dimension to the intimate partner violence that straight people don't have to deal with.
And that's very much so, even in dating violence relationships that I've seen a lot, especially because many of them have not come out to families. I've seen that used as a mechanism of power and control by the abuser, where it's, the same thing, if you, I didn't do this, or I'm going to say this, or I'm going to out you, or I'm going to tell your family, or I'm going to tell your friends, and especially if they have a good relationship with the family or with the friends of that person. So, yeah, I've seen it the same too in dating violence.
What about services for LGBTQ individuals? Are there specific services or accessibility for them?
We have a specific intervention. So we utilize something called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy as one of our interventions, and they have within that, there's also an approach that is tailored to LGBTQ. It basically just goes into a little bit more detail of what it is that they might be experiencing cognitively, if they're having some dissonance or things that are identity related. So we do have tailored interventions that we will offer if someone's willing to identify themselves that way and are saying that that's what they want. We might incorporate that for them. We do not discriminate, and so if somebody comes in and wants to use pronouns, even if they're a kiddo, if that's what they're telling us that we want to use, that's what we'll use with them. And sometimes parents get mad about that, but we have a separate discussion with them, and sometimes it becomes really important we incorporate that into the family work that we do.
I think with LGBTQ, I think it's also the same, kind of the same path that I've seen, to where they hesitate to report or hesitate to reach out to services, because maybe they have tried and they were not taken as serious, or maybe pronouns were not used, or they weren't respected as so, and so it makes it more difficult. And then even then, I've even seen victims who were LGBTQ and did not have support from home. So like, I would respond to the hospital and they had nobody there with them. They didn't want to report, right? It was them by themselves, kind of trying to navigate the process of, if I report this is what's gonna happen, right? Like, this is who's gonna know, this is who I'm gonna have to tell, especially when it came to teens and parents had to get involved. It was, to them, it felt more of a disservice of, it was my fault that this happened, and so now everybody has to know about what happened. And it's even worse when there is no support, because then it's more like the survivor or the victim is not feeling like they're gonna get the help at all. And so that's where I think it's hard for them too.
Great, thank you, and congrats to the audience who all got that question right. Good job. All right, next question. This is 7 out of 10. Family violence theories explain behaviors at which of the following levels? Individual, familial, societal, all of the above. I mean, if you take a lot of tests, you might know what the answer might be. Got 10 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So the answer is all of the above. So family violence theories explain family violence at all 3 levels: individual, familial, and societal. So I'm wondering if our panelists can talk a bit about how these systems or these structures larger than the individual can impact family violence.
The structures.
Society, expectations, institutions,
Are we
organizations.
impacting the victim?
So I think when we talk about an individual, right, and then we talk about familial, is who are they, where do they live, economic status, religion, and then we go into like, what family systems do they have in place, what kind of family support do they have. But I think that one, and then when we talked about society, how does society view family violence, right? How do we talk about it? Is it seen as something that's taboo, which is, it still happens, people still talk about family violence like it only happens in certain places. It only happens to certain families. And I mean, it's surprising because we want to break that stigma, but I've gone to presentations, I've gone to places where, people will still say, oh yeah, family violence only happens to low income, right? Or a certain race. And I'm just like, no, it does not. I've seen all walks of life, and it happens to everybody. But I think with society too, how are we educating? What are we implementing on how are we talking about this topic? If we are seeing it as a taboo subject, then we are a part of the problem. If we're not talking about it like it's normal, then we're not changing it, right? It's still continuing, and it's not changing at all. And we're looking at family violence like it doesn't happen, when really the person sitting next to you could have grown up in it or are going through it,
I'd like to piggyback on that. Like, a lot of people think that because we're nonprofits and we don't charge for services, that the only people that we service are people who qualify for those kinds of things, but that's not true. I mean, we see people from all over, socioeconomic, cultural, like location, they're all over the place. And it's just not those things, it only happens to low income families, or it only happens to, families that aren't paying attention, or, this, that, and the other. I don't think that's correct. Like, it's just all over the place. We see families that they are so shocked because they're like, this doesn't happen to someone like me. It happens all over the place, and it's not a specific population that has to deal with these issues. It's all across the board.
And I'll make a comment on the theoretical of it. I wish there was one explanation that I could give you, or any of us could give you, that could explain family violence, but there isn't. And that's often the thing that I say to my students when I teach theory is, it would be really awesome if I could say A plus B equals C and then I could solve crime. But you can't. And family violence, you know, there are so many different reasons, whether it's societal, individual related, cultural. It's a hard thing to understand, and that's why I'm so grateful that you two work doing this day to day.
It also manifests in the way that people handle that healing process afterward. Post-traumatic stress, just because someone has experienced something that we identify as a trauma being something that overwhelms your ability to cope, they don't necessarily always develop post-traumatic stress. You know, they can be really resilient, or maybe they have lots of resources and support and things like that. So not everybody who comes into counter with something like this, you know, sexual abuse or domestic violence, or, you know, even neglect as a child, is going to develop those, you know, symptoms. And so sometimes people come in and we're like, yeah, you're great. Like, you're doing great. You might have gone through something scary, but, you know, you don't meet the criteria, and, you know, we're going to do safety services and send you on your way. And the parents are like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And you're like, no, yeah, they're doing fine. They're very resilient. They're okay. And that is also part of that process, and it's impacted by those types of systems.
I think that's a great point, and part of why I put this question in is because a lot of individuals feel to blame for what happened to them. But if you take a class with me, such as Transformative Justice, we want to think about how communities and society can be held accountable to prevent harm from even starting, and then how to support survivors once they've been harmed.
Does everyone know that every single person in Texas is a state-mandated reporter?
Including instructors,
yeah.
faculty.
Everyone is a state-mandated reporter. If you see abuse, you're duty-bound to report it. I didn't know that either. And sometimes we have parents that come in and they're like, well, I didn't know I had to report something like this. And now I have this case, the CPS case, and they're very concerned. And yeah, everyone is a reporter. If you suspect it, reporting it is the best thing to do.
Thank you, panelists. We're going to go to our next question. And good job, students. All of you got that right. All right. This is 8 out of 10. Researchers find that family violence can become intergenerational and learned from one generation to another. Is that true or false? Is family violence sometimes or often intergenerational? True or false? We got 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. I don't know. What's the answer? The answer is true. Researchers, and I'm sure people who work in the community, find that family violence can be intergenerational, or learned or passed on, from one generation to the next. So I was wondering if our panelists could talk about what they've seen in the field with this.
So the way that I see this is, so part of like what I do, I also go into high schools and I go into middle schools and I educate on healthy relationships and bullying. And when I tell you these kids love to talk, they love to talk. And no filters, which I love too. So we'll talk about bullying, we'll talk about healthy relationships, and many times I'll ask questions on something that relates to them, right? As simple as, who in here is dating already, right? And who in here shares passwords or thinks it's okay to share passwords with their boyfriend's girlfriend? And they all raise their hands like, yeah, absolutely. And then many of the times they'll tell me, I'll ask, well, why? Why is that okay? And they'll say, well, because it's a sense of trust. And I'll say, oh, really? Okay, well, tell me why. And so they start saying, well, I've seen this, and this is how I know that trust is, right? And so I start picking up on what they learn or what they were taught. And even in a sense, I'll sometimes ask, you know, what does consent mean? And I remember I had a 17-year-old student who said, Miss, you know what consent is? And I said, absolutely, tell me what it is. And he's like, it's a piece of paper that you have to make a girl sign, because then they're going to say that they didn't say yes. And I was like, oh, wow. And I was like, who are your parents? But it tells me a lot about what they're learning, right? And I'm like, okay, consent is not a binding contract, you know, it can be taken back, you know, but it tells me a lot of what they pick up and what they learn. And so when I do, for example, presentations on the healthy relationships or the effects of domestic violence on children, I will have kids who will tell me, this is what I see at home, so this is not normal. And I'll say no. And then I have to have them step out. And it's sad because it's normalized. And so because it's normalized, then they start dating, and then they start acting out the same way in those relationships that they saw that they thought it was normal. And not necessarily them being abusive. Sometimes they see it to then they fall victims of abuse. And they become a victim of abuse because they think it's okay for somebody to control them. They think that it's okay for somebody to talk to them a certain way or to have that power over them, but because that's what they saw. Not that it happens to everybody, so that's why I was on the fence with this question. But what I have seen at schools and working with students for the past 3 years is absolutely, definitely can be passed down to one another.
And that means learned.
I see this manifest usually, I'm having to pull parents in to teach them about like de-escalation. So I have a saying, an escalated adult cannot de-escalate a child. And so this idea of you have to learn to regulate yourself, parent, in order to break these type of patterns. You don't want to pass this stuff down to those generations. So, you know, it's up to us to relearn how to treat our kiddos, treat ourselves, break those patterns, what we will and will not tolerate, you know, having healthier boundaries, and, you know, just relearning some of those things that maybe they did at one point in time was very functional for them. It served them very well. It kept them alive. It was something that they developed to, you know, that was working for them, but now they're in a different place in their life and they need to learn something different. And so we teach them to think about things in a different way, which is the cornerstone of CBT, right? Your thoughts drive your feelings drives your behavior. And so those things are what we kind of hone in on for parents to teach them, hey, you want to break these patterns, you want to learn how to interact differently with your kid because you want them to interact a different way or behave a different way. It starts with you.
So in my previous life, I taught classes to parents who had contact with the system because of suspected or proven child abuse. And they parented the way they had been parented, and their parents had parented them. So it was very much, you know, putting cigarettes out on a child is not like a way of punishing them, right? It's child abuse. And so the fact that you have to educate people in that way shows you that that was how they learned to parent. And as the question says, researchers have seen this time and time again with lots of different families over, you know, generations. And so it can be really hard to break that, and that can also be how people sort of revert back to, because it's what they know.
Especially if they don't know it's abuse. They think it's normal. Great, thank you, panelists, and good job, audience. We're going to go to our next question, which is number 9. Nothing can be done to prevent family violence. True or false? Nothing can be done to prevent family violence. True or false? This was a quick one. I think all of you might have gotten it. Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. See the leaderboard since we only got one question after this. All right, good job. These are the people to beat up here. Okay, great job. So most of you got it. The answer is false. It is incorrect to assume that nothing can be done to prevent family violence. So I was wondering if our panelists could talk a little bit about what we can do to prevent family violence.
I'll start and say by being at this panel is one of them. Education and understanding family violence is a big one, as we just kind of talked about, knowing what is abuse, knowing how you can help people who are in those situations, and even knowing what services are available could potentially help prevent. I knew someone who was having some issues with anger, and so being able to refer her to anger management or a therapist, that's something simple, right? But that could prevent from taking out that anger on their children. So for me as a professor, educating and understanding what resources you need.
I think awareness is something that we try to do. I mean, one of the reasons we're here at this panel today is to have more presence in the community. We're working on, letting people know that we are here, that we service the community, that, there are places for people to get help and education and healing. And I think that's part of our mission to make that more accessible. We used to only serve families that had been exposed to sexual abuse. And we have taken that and broadened the services that we offer to, domestic violence and witness to crimes and things like that. And so, as we continue to open our doors and service more individuals, I hope that community awareness, people are talking about it and bringing that up, hey, like, I don't like the way that your friend treats you. Like, have you thought about these things? The more education we have on what healthy relationships look like and what power and control relationships look like, we can call that behavior out within our communities, within our social relationships and ourselves, and seek out that help, like referring your friend to, no, I'm sure nobody likes to hear that. Man, have you thought about anger management, man? Like, that sounds like a heavy conversation. But yeah, hey, you might need some services. I've got a great number for you to call.
And I completely agree with both of you. I think it starts with creating the conversation, as simple as that, being open to it, being okay with starting the conversation. Because when I think about this question of nothing can be done, it makes me think of when people think that family violence is a private family matter, when it's not. Sometimes people say, it's none of our business, don't get involved. But you can do as little as asking somebody, are you okay? Do you need anything? What can I do to help you? Even as simple as telling somebody, I believe you, can be a world of a difference rather than just ignoring what's going on. So, you as simple as being here is part of changing the way that we look at family and domestic violence, because we want to break that stigma, right? We want to break that cycle, and educating, creating that conversation, healthy relationships. Changing the way that we talk about it. And I'm so passionate about youth, and everywhere I go, these abusive relationships are called toxic, And I'm just like, but what does that really mean, right? Toxic this, toxic that. And I'm like, and I make them list out examples of what toxic means. And then I'm like, okay, now tell me what are some examples of abuse? And then they both correlate, and they're like, oh. Okay, so then I'm like, okay, well, why don't you just throw the word abuse around? Well, no, that sounds much more harsher. And I'm like, but it's practically the same thing. And so it's about saying that we should not excuse it because it's called this way or another, right? Or because you're used to seeing that, right? It's about saying something, helping somebody out in any way that you can, and then also starting that conversation.
Great, thank you, panelists, and good job, audience. We have our final question, so if you're looking to get top 3, this is your chance. All right, get ready. Resources for those experiencing family violence exist on campus and in the community. Is that true or false? Resources for those experiencing family violence exist on campus and in the community. True or false? 5 seconds. 2, 1. Oh, here we go. Who's the winner? It'll show the final leaderboard after, but looking pretty good for these 3. All right, so the answer is true. There are both resources on campus and in the community. We only have 5 minutes left of our panel, so I was wondering if our panelists could talk very briefly about what resources are available here at SHSU and off campus in the community.
Oh man, Dr. Bree, it's been a minute since I've been here. Do you still have a counseling center here?
We sure do.
Okay. So I can speak to the community piece. You guys still have a counseling center on campus, so I'm assuming all of you guys are familiar with it. You can go receive services there. In the community, if you're in any of the touching counties with us and you have been identified as a victim of crime, we usually get referrals. You can actually call the agency itself and see if you qualify to come in for a referral, or we also offer community referrals. Sometimes people come in and they are victims of crime, but they're just not, they don't meet criteria for like trauma treatment, so we'll refer them out. That's those cases that are like really resilient, or maybe cases that are contentious and involve like custody and stuff like that. We don't do any of those type of recommendations, so we do refer out for that kind of stuff as well. But we are not the end all be all in Conroe that services that area. There's a ton of other community services that are right near us. We have Tri-County Behavioral, we have the Women's Center, which is our lovely partner with us. We have lots of different private practitioners and things like that that we refer out to, as well as other community centers, Yes to Youth and all kinds of things. So if you guys are interested in any of that stuff, feel free to give one of our agencies a call and ask if you need referrals or you're just interested in those kinds of things. We offer all kinds of stuff like that.
So I'm going to move it ahead to the final leaderboard for sake of time. But there are lots of resources both on campus and in the community, and the one I recommend most is the same as Megan, the Counseling Center, which offers peer support groups too. And they offer confidential resources for students. So let's see who is the winner. Oh, maybe not. Oh, here we go. Third is Brady, second is Emily, and first is Jake. So good job, everybody. If you want to come up and get your prizes, and then I'm going to leave it open for questions in the last few minutes. If you want to ask some questions to our panelists, you can go ahead and do that. Yeah.
So she was asking if, for the Montgomery County Women's Center, have we ever thought about changing our name? And the answer is yes, a very big yes. We have been around for over 40 years. We actually used to be known as the Crisis Coalition or something like that. And I'm like, why did we not keep it? I love what I do and I love working there. I just don't like the name. And so every time people will say, oh, you guys are the Women's Center. And I'm like, yeah. But we service everybody, and it does throw people off on what we do, but absolutely, that is something that I've been pushing for 5 years now. So I'm hoping that that's something that we can change, because we don't only service women. Absolutely. So thank you.
Great, thank you. We have a question.
So the question was, do our agencies work with policy advocates? And if we do work with them, what kinds of things are we trying to put into legislation? We do. That's a really specific question. I'm not involved. That's a little bit above my pay grade. But I know that we do work very closely with our local agencies, and as far as legislation, these things are being legislated. There was recently a really big change with CPS and what they can and can't do. You know, terminology, all kinds of different things. That's a very specific question. I don't have a very specific answer, but the answer I know is yes, we are involved. I just don't know in what capacity.
For those of you leaving, thank you so much for coming. I know you probably have other classes and things, so thank you.
So I know that we work closely with the Texas Council on Family Violence. So if you ever go to their website, tcfe.org, we do monthly meetings for the prevention team. And so with them, we're always looking on changing policies on how we educate our youth. And that's more specific for just youth, but it's more about targeting them as young as we can so that we can start creating that conversation. But I know we've definitely done a lot of changes in policy regarding to bringing healthy relationships curriculums to schools, because not a lot of districts will allow conversations that to come in, and if they do, we're limited on what we're allowed to say. And so we're pushing on being able to talk about more of this, because when we don't have schools on board, it creates that stigma of we still shouldn't talk about it when it's happening everywhere. So yeah.
Great, excellent questions. We're about out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up there. If you have any lingering questions or anything, I'm going to leave my cards up here. If you want to ask anything, I can forward it. I want to thank our panelists so much for taking time out of their busy schedules with their big workloads. So thank you everyone who came today. If you want to sign in, you can get extra credit for your classes. If you have a class with me,